Today we're going to be talking about tutoring L2 learners. You know that we have a huge population of ESL students coming to LAVC, and we have probably encountered and tutored them for a while. So let's share with your experiences first, tutoring L2 learners. What kind of experiences do you have? Was it good? Was it positive? Was it maybe you had some challenges that you want to share with us? So let's take a minute and go back and see if we can remember any instances. Yes.
So generally with English as a second language tutees, they're my favorite kind of student to tutor because there's like a whole breadth of options that you can approach when you're trying to help them, right? So there are definitely challenges, and I think the biggest challenges are usually my lack of understanding of the basic like grammatical concepts in the English language, like how to explain them when I've been using them my whole life, right? So finding easy and simple ways to explain simple grammatical concepts is, I think, would be very helpful. But generally, it's a lot of fun to tutor L2 learners.
So it's a lot of fun because their motivational level is a little bit higher sometimes, right? They're more willing to learn and they want to learn more because they're very excited. Well, they want to achieve some good grades and they are willing to put in extra work for that. What have you, yeah.
The main thing I've noticed is like the vocabulary. Like
Okay.
they know, they have something they're like dying to say, but they don't have the vocabulary
Yes.
for it. So in some ways it's actually kind of fun to help them sort of get their thoughts out and teach them new words. And Google Translate helps not in long sentences, but in like single words. If you're trying to explain something and you just find like one simple word and they're like, oh, that thing.
Yeah, and sometimes showing the same word in their own language may help them understand it a little bit better. We may not know, we're not experts in all languages, but sometimes that can help us too. Yeah, exactly.
In terms of ESL students, it tends to be the language barriers. You see the sense that they know the ideas that they would want to put onto paper, but communicating that to a tutor, that doesn't speak their native language, or a sense in that case doesn't get their ideas, because they understand it in their language but can't convey it in English. So I think that's a difficult part, but I think with time and effort and then finding a way to get it on the paper, it usually gets there.
That's a very good point we're going to be discussing in the presentation today to see who are our L2 learners. When I say L2 learners, I mean ESL learners, and how we can specifically help them while tutoring them. So there are some major differences between native speakers and second language speakers, of course. And one of the differences is the way L2 learners process the new concept while acquiring a new language. So it's fundamentally different. And research shows that most of the time, they need to be literate in at least one language to be able to acquire the second language. They usually need a foundation. They base everything against that foundation. If they have high literacy skills in their first language, it's going to be easier for them to acquire the second language. So there are a lot of processes they are going through while they're listening to us and trying to process the information. There's a lot more going on in their heads. So learning experiences and expectations are different. As we all know, some of them are coming from completely different cultures, and the way cultures approach education and learning experiences are different, and the way we expect, our expectations approaching education and coming into classroom actually can be different. Writing process and structure is different as well. We have a very clear structural organization that we expect students to accomplish when they're trying to write an essay, right? But it's not the same in every culture. So the structure requirements, coherence, expectations are completely different from culture to culture. And once you ask them, they're going to tell you. I had a Bengali student, two Bengali students actually, and I asked them, so how do you construct an essay? How do you write an essay? Where do you put your thesis statement? At first they were very surprised, like they looked at each other and they looked at me, and then they said, wow, yes, we put the thesis statement somewhere in the middle of the essay. We don't necessarily put it in the introduction. So they don't even realize it sometimes how different those expectations are unless we try to point them and help them with that. So, and then social value of the text vary from culture to culture. For example, in our culture, in Western culture, we usually tear everything apart, right? The word analysis means putting everything, separating everything apart and putting it back together to see if it matches. But in some traditional cultures, they don't do that. They approach text with different attitude. They try to summarize the points because this is something that had been handed down to them from generation to generation. So they have a different approach to the text. They try to preserve the way it is instead of criticizing, analyzing it. So that's a different approach to the text as well, from culture to culture. And understanding these concepts will help us better help them. So, difficulty in effectively expressing themselves in English, vocabulary and intuitively ability to understand the language. And then hence comes the frustration at being unable to convey their ideas in appropriate language. Like you just mentioned, it feels like they have more going on than what you see on the paper, right? They have good ideas, but lack of linguistic resources to convey them. So it makes it really hard for them to write in English and express their ideas. So let's read this paragraph, for example, and try to understand, what do you make of this? How would you react in this case scenario? So it shows some level of frustration, right? Anger, because I feel like, he says, I feel like I have everything on the paper, but it's still not clear for my professor. So it goes to show that it's not a thought problem because their thought and ideas are in place, but it's a problem of language and being able to put everything into paper. Yes.
Yeah, what I see from this is that it's difficult for this student to shape his ideas into the structure of the essay, right? Like he's not used to, or she's not used to putting it into the specific structure that's required. Because he says he can get it in English, he can't write it down correctly, and he says his essay is not academic.
Yes.
So by not being academic, that probably means maybe he needs practice with the structure.
Yes. Structure, and then he says, still quite unskillful, and what I want to say isn't expressed, isn't explained in my essay. But then he say, I always look like, it always feels like I have it there, but the instructors don't see it, right? I'm not able to convey what I'm trying to say clearly on the paper. So it comes down to some level of frustration because you know that your ideas are there, everything is there, you just need to put it in the writing, and that's a difficulty for you because you have a difficulty expressing yourself. So linguistic conventions do not successfully translate across languages. Sometimes when I want to say something in my language, it doesn't necessarily sound the same way in a different language. Like especially when it comes to phrases, learning phrases in English is a totally different story, right? Because for example, when you say it's raining cats and dogs, we know exactly what it means. But when an L2 learner listens to that, hears that for the first time, it's really difficult for them to understand what you want to say because it cannot translate word by word, right? It's a phrase. So, and then the sentence I wrote that seemed explicit to me were not explicit enough for my professor. So again, it goes to show that the language barrier is giving them a hard time to express themselves. So let's look at this case. How would you react? What would you do in this case? Or maybe you had an experience like this. How do you perceive his actions?
So it looks like this is a student who highly values respect and authority and is not necessarily used to taking independent academic actions.
What would you do in this case?
I think I'd just continue to ask questions until I started to get some answers. But I'm not sure if that would be the best approach.
I've noticed that happens a lot where they, if they've never been here before, they sort of wait to sit down. I'm sure it's several different cultures where they're used to someone telling them. So I just tell them, go ahead and sit down, get comfortable. I'm going to sit where you want me to sit. Where do you want me to sit? And start asking them what they want. And they realize, oh, I kind of have some authority in this situation.
Oh, yeah. So giving them authority, giving them some freedom to make their own decision at that point may help. Obviously, it may help. Yeah. So this shows how different our cultural perceptions are and different understanding of authority. Because in some cultures, it's completely normal. It's a complete normal behavior. But here in our culture, we like looking into the eyes, talking to people, asking questions, right? But it's not necessarily the same in different cultures. So from his perspective, he's exhibiting a polite behavior appropriate for the Japanese students. He silently waits to be addressed, which is the appropriate thing to do in his culture. So having that sensitivity, trying to understand where they're coming from, is very important because they're not trying to be rude, it's just what their cultural background teaches them. So who are our L2 learners? So there are differences between the L2 learners that we work with on a daily basis. So after the World War, we've seen a huge amount of immigration, and then researchers noticed that ESL students are changing. The population is changing. It was at one point was very easy to identify who's an ESL student because they are just international students. But then the population changed. The gap between the L2 learners changed. Now they had different types of L2 learners, so they had to categorize to be able to understand the new population a little bit better. So in terms of formal and versus everyday language knowledge, they categorized ear learners and eye learners. In terms of arrival, they have early arrivals, late arrivals, and international students. And they all belong to ESL community in this case. And then cultural backgrounds in LAVC, I noticed a lot of students from Ukraine, Russia, Bengal, Georgia, Armenia, Persia, Russia. And then when it comes to Armenians, we have Armenians from Persia, Russia, again Armenia, Georgia. So it's a mix of cultures that we have in here. So who are the L2 learners and I learners? So I learners are most international students who have been studying the language intentionally. So in this case, they have an academic literacy at some point because they know the grammar rules. And in academic terms, they have an advantage because they have a better learning skills. They have reading and writing skills as opposed to other types of learners. So when it comes to ill learners, they may or may not be fluent in their first language, but most of the time they learn the language through hearing. It can be TV, peer conversations, day-to-day business, talking, shopping. So they learn English subconsciously through oral trial and error. But when it comes to academic literacy, their English is not there yet. But at first when you talk to them, it feels like they have a good command of English and their literacy is very good. But when it comes to academic writing and learning, their English is very, very different. So again, e-learners have cultural exposure, which gives them advantage, opportunities of interaction, and foundation in everyday vocabulary. So they somehow have an intuitive understanding of language, which gives them an advantage, as opposed to the international students. But when it comes to academic, they may or may not have literacy experience in the L1 language, which makes it very difficult for them to acquire the second language. Because remember, you need the first language literacy to be able to succeed in learning the second language. And then no experience in academic language. And of course, the counterintuitive finding of the research shows that the L2 students who are the most successful academically are not the ones who have lived in the L2 dominant country, but the ones who have L1 literacy skills. Once they are literate in their first language, then they're going to be more literate in acquiring the second language.
Question.
Yes.
What does late arrival and early arrival mean?
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't even know that. So, early arrival students are the students who have been here before 8-year-old. That's how they consider it. Before they were 8 years old. In some instances, they were even born here, but they're still considered ESL students because they were born to in non-English speakers families. So those are early arrival students. Later arrival students have been here probably less than 8 years. That's what they consider late arriving students. So they're in between two ends of ERI learner continuum. And then international students are the easiest one to identify because these are the students who came here maybe to continue their education or to seek a career advancement. Most of the cases they go back because they're visa students. So those are the international students. Okay. So when it comes to listening and speaking, international students may have the most challenges, most difficulty, because of the cultural expectations in the classrooms, and then the oral class participation because they need to use the language. Ear learners may seem more comfortable until the instructor receives their writing and sees that their academic language is not there yet. So yeah, cultural expectations. When it comes to learning and the class participation can be very different from culture to culture. In some cultures, you're not required to participate. You just sit there and listen, as opposed to the American-style classroom, when you are part of the classroom, when you're required to participate, and it's more informal and laid back. So they may have a lot of difficulties in that area. So when it comes to reading, research shows that nearly all L2 learners struggle with learning, specifically with vocabulary or discipline-specific vocabulary, or understanding writing prompts and requirements. And as tutors, we need to make sure that we start from there, trying to understand if the student actually knows what are the expectations and what are the requirements of the writing prompts before even going over the actual assignment. So we need to make sure they understand the requirements first. So when it comes to writing, L2 learners struggle with language most because they are trying to accomplish many tasks at the same time. Like they're trying to learn the language, meanwhile they're trying to learn how to write. So they're doing several tasks, multiple tasks at the same time, as opposed to native speakers who have some valuable tools at their hand because they know and understand the language intuitively. So that gives them an advantage as opposed to L2 learners. So when it comes to vocabulary, they may have difficulty differentiating between the word used. For example, tell, speak, or say a story. So these are different words that you can use, but sometimes it takes a cultural exposure to be able to understand. Sometimes prepositions also pose a difficulty for ESL learners as well. So I have different types of texts from students. Some of them are early, late arrival students and international students. So I wanted us to take a look at it and see if we can identify who's who. So first text is Joan's text. And then Hector's and Luciana. Let's take a minute and try to analyze and see how would you identify them.
Hector's text, late arrival, and Luciana, early arrival.
Do you agree? So why do you think that Joan's text is international?
Because it has the staples of a more academically written paragraph piece. He tells a story and then he analyzes afterwards, saying even though Thaler claims that line can protect an intimate relationship, it doesn't work in my cases. So it seems like he has a good understanding of what needs to, like he's answering a writing prompt.
Mm-hmm. But he has difficulty in trying to put the correct grammatical concepts in its place.
And maybe using the same words over and over again where he could use new words. Yeah.
Right. What do you guys think? Do you agree? Yeah? So yeah, Joan is international student. And we see there is a strength in paragraph confusion, you're right. There is a clear structure, but the word choice is repetitive, sentence structure is simple, and sometimes the words are not used correctly. Like, for example, imagine instead of imagine. So you feel like he understands the words, but he just has a difficult time putting the correct word version in a sentence. And then Hector's text. Any ideas about that?
Like late arrival.
Late arrival student. Is there a particular reason?
And just because there are a lot of mistakes where they're misusing words.
Mm-hmm.
And it sounds like he's just giving a summary of things, right? So
Okay.
he hasn't figured out, or she hasn't figured out that it's, unless he's being asked for a summary, but he's just kind of telling things in the order they happened without giving any other context to it.
Okay. Any other thoughts?
Did you say Hector's was again?
The second one is Hector.
I know, but what did you say?
I said it was late arrival.
What's the difference between that and international? I guess I'm a little confused still about the labels.
Well, the late arrival are students who have been in this country for a while and have been accustomed to the culture, more or less.
Like you said, like 8 years, right?
Yes.
Okay. And then
The international students are on student visa. They could have been just here
Like
for a
here,
year.
okay.
Then
Yeah, you're correct. So Hector is late arriving student. So he has a basic comprehension of the plot, content, conflict in the novel, but he actually summarizes it very nicely. But yeah, he still misses some points. He has problems with punctuation, word choice, verb tense. And the limited vocabulary is another problem that he has in the text. And the last one, Luciana's text.
That's somebody who like grew up in this country, right? They kind of give it away in the
Yes.
story, though. I'll admit.
You have the sense, right? No, she's been here in the country for a while, and she has a good intuitive understanding of the language, but she lacks the academic skills of laying out the facts. So her style is more conversational and informal when it comes to writing. So these are different types of the text our students may produce depending on who they are and where they come from. Okay? So how can we help them? So ask questions. We have an ESL form in our folders that we've recently inserted. Have you seen that? So it has specific questions that you can consider, like for example, it doesn't have how many years you've been here, but asking those questions may actually help you to understand where they're coming from. But we didn't want to get too personal asking those questions on a sheet. But we have questions such as, which language is English language for you? In some instances, it's not even the second language, it's third language, it's the fourth language. So knowing and understanding this can help us. And then what level is your English? What level of class you're taking in ESL? So that can help us understand their background as well. How long have you been studying English? How do you find difficulty? What do you find difficult about learning English language? So use the sheet in the folder to get some ideas. But again, for the purpose of not being too personal, asking personal questions every time they come in, we didn't include all of it, but you can ask questions to kind of understand where they're coming from.
Are all the ESL students going to have that, or wasn't it just that guy, Hubbard?
No, they all have it.
They're all going to have it?
They all have it, yes. If you don't notice, if you don't see it, just let us know so we can add that, yes. Because we're tracking their success, it helps us to understand where they're coming from, what problems they have, and how we're helping them, if we're helping them. It helps us understand their tracking success rate as well. So ask questions and set goals. As we know, sometimes when ESL students come here, they have different expectations from what we can actually offer to them. So setting goals will clear that up. Sometimes they want us to do the actual work for them, type the article, the essay for them. So setting goals will actually help to clarify that. So what do you want to concentrate on today? Ask them questions. Make suggestions as to what specifically you could tackle in one session. Ask if they have instructor's notes, previous work perhaps, or, well, so basically clarify the goals, make a plan of the tutoring, but also be flexible, because as you go, you may notice some other things that may need to pay attention to. So you can set the goals, but at the same time be very flexible in following them. So stick to the plan, be open to changes at the same time, and check off items from the goal list as you progress, as you go, to see that you've accomplished something during the tutoring session. It may help them see what they've learned, actually. When it comes to handouts and materials for ESL students, I've developed a few handouts for them, which are more visual, and they contain the most basic information for them. We have an ESL section in there. I'm still updating some of the handouts, and I'm creating new ones. So you're more than welcome to use those. They're very visual, and they're very basic information. So that may help them as well, to take home something with them and go over the information you covered during the tutoring session. So what do you think? Should they read their written work when they come in for the tutoring session?
I usually say yes.
Have you tried it with ESL students? Did it work?
It has. I haven't yet encountered someone who's very uncomfortable with reading it out loud.
Okay.
I'll usually start it off by saying it can help if you read it out loud to identify your errors.
Yeah, so it depends on the situation. The suggestion is to have them read their own paper because it gives them an authority over their work. But sometimes it can actually affect their self-esteem. So we don't want to put them in the corner and have them read. So if you feel like they're not comfortable with reading the text, it's okay. They don't have to do it at this point. So we need to be careful and sensitive to this kind of details. It may make a change. So asking questions. What do you mean by that? How do you write in your first language? What was the assignment? What is your central point or main argument? So asking them questions may help them. So sometimes you see a lot of good ideas scattered all over the place, or sometimes you don't even see a connection between these two. But when you ask them questions, it happens so many times when I ask them, like, what do you mean by this? They start explaining it, and you see a logical connection. They're actually good at proving their points. It's just they're having a difficult time connecting their ideas in written. So ask them questions to find out more, and that will help. Also, pointing to the ways they do the same thing in their own language may help them understand the differences. Once they understand the differences, they will be more reflective about the writing process. And when it comes to giving feedback, there is a difference between feedback and error correction. And we should be very careful about this when we're giving feedback to our students. There are different perspectives on giving feedback. Some may say that you don't even need feedback because they eventually will self-correct. And feedback is more positive than negative. Error correction is more negative, but feedback is more positive and neutral. So based on Chomsky, negative error correction is unnecessary, counterproductive, and harmful. He basically says that people have this intuitive ability to acquire the language. We don't have to correct them all the time, and they will self-correct eventually. Cognitive perspective teaches us that learners are bound to commit errors. It's a process. This happens when they test hypotheses about the target language. So sometimes mistakes give us insight into their first language. So instead of just correcting all the mistakes, it can be helpful for us to take a look at those mistakes and try to understand where they're coming from. And sometimes correcting every mistake may not be actually very helpful. So we need to be very selective at choosing what mistakes we're concentrating, prioritize things, and see which are the mistakes that you feel like are necessary at this point to point out and correct. Because too much correction, too much error correction may lead to fossilization. Researchers show this happen all the time among L2 learners because they're just overwhelmed with the information, they stop learning. It becomes counterproductive.
So what is fossilization?
It's the point when they reach this specific area when they're not ready to acquire the new information. We force them into them, they just stop learning. So that's basically it. So we need to be very careful.
So so it said earlier that it's natural to have errors in your language because they're testing their hypothesis in their new language, right? But any hypothesis needs to have like a conclusion, whether it's correct or incorrect, right? So how will they, like if you see them making errors, how do you identify them without the error correction?
So what I'm saying is prioritize the errors.
I see.
See if it's actually necessary for them to correct at this point. If you feel like it's not necessary, concentrate on the ones that are more important at that point. Pointing all the mistakes will not help.
I feel like the ones that make it unclear, that's what I go for. Where I really can't understand what the sentence is saying, those are the errors that I'll focus on.
Maybe sentence structure, right?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's more, structural even than grammatical so much. And that, what do you mean question usually comes into play. And sometimes you end up rewriting the whole sentence anyway. So then the error correction is sort of moot, because if you just corrected the error and you still don't really get what they're saying, who cares, right?
Yeah. And they eventually will self-correct at one point. So our job is to point the common mistakes, the mistakes that are completely necessary for them to correct at this point. So these are the sources that I've been using. If you're interested, I can give you some extra information and you can go over them. And then I have a short video for us to conclude our session, and it actually summarizes very nicely from the ESL student perspective. This one's
Chika. I'm originally Indian, but I've lived in Hong Kong for my whole life.
My name is Jinglu. I'm from Guangzhou, China, where they speak Cantonese.
My name is Chelsea Pieroni. I'm Italian American, but I've lived in Italy all my life.
I am Eve Subaku. I'm from Thailand.
My name is Susan, and I'm from China.
I speak fluently Hindi and English. I speak Spanish somewhat fluently and only a little bit of Mandarin, but a little bit of that too.
My native language is Cantonese. I speak Mandarin in school, and I learned English in school, and I'm learning French right now.
My first language is Italian, the second language is English, and I studied Latin and Greek for 5 years.
I speak Thai, English, a little bit of Japanese.
I speak Mandarin.
I think at Duke, it's really interesting to see the different writing styles because people have come from so many different backgrounds, not only educational but cultural as well.
I only took English until I was about 15, so it wasn't that long. And we never really was sat down and told what to, like a kind of construction that we need to write.
Writing is not a huge part of our academic requirement. We do have writing tasks in our exams, but it's just really basic, like write a letter or email.
We have to write essays, but in very, very certain way. They give you a question, but instead of arguing for or against it, you're writing down some specific points you were told to write.
I've been taught rigorously all the grammatical and all the semantics in the Italian language, and it's just hard to switch over now and write something that makes sense, let alone write something that's nice to read.
Here, teachers are more interested in what you think and what's your opinion, what's your stand. And at first I was like, oh my god, I don't even have a stand.
In terms of the trouble for writing here, it's come mainly because I feel like the topics are really vague and it's up to the student what we should write about.
I'm used to the prompt that guides you line by line. What you have to do in the first paragraph, what you have to do in the second. And now it's like a whole blank paper and you have to draw your